Welcome, everybody from no doubt all around the world to another Fortuna MBA Admissions Masterclass. This is the fourth in a series of webinars that we've been running every Wednesday for the last few weeks, in which the Fortuna team of former admissions gatekeepers take you through specifically the essays that are at the heart of the applications to the world's top business schools. And now in the last 3 weeks, I've been joined by expert coaches from Fortuna who are former admissions at Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, Chicago Booth, Columbia, MIT, Sloan, Kellogg, Berkeley, Yale, Duke, UCLA, Anderson. It's been an incredible few weeks, and I feel blessed to share all of this insight and expertise that my colleagues have. So today, of course, is the turn of the top international business schools beyond the US, and specifically INSEAD, the London Business School, and HEC Paris, that of course all shine in the FT MBA rankings and elsewhere. Now we're looking at what is almost certain to be a record-breaking year for application volumes. In fact, INSEAD is a sort of a canary in the coal mine, given that they have a January 2021 start. They shared that their round 2 application volume was up by 57%. Now, these top schools, they're selective anyway. It's just got a whole lot more selective. So, of course, the idea of today's webinar is to really give you the sort of insights and background for how you can shine in your applications. My name is Matt Symonds. I write about business education for Forbes, formerly for BusinessWeek and for the Economist. My great joy is to be a co-director at Fortuna with so many great colleagues. And I'm joined today by 3 of them will be taking us through the INSEAD, LBS and HEC formats. In terms of the content for today, I mentioned the qualifications of the team and obviously our focus on top European schools today. I encourage you for all of the webinars we've previously recorded, in fact, for just an absolute wealth of material that these insider admissions experts already put together, whether it's about letters of recommendation, whether it's about GMAT versus the GRE, whether it's about timing for applications. Today, as I said, we're going to be focusing on the essays for those 3 schools. But if you go to our Fortuna Admissions YouTube channel, you will be able to find all of those other webinars. And of course, you can reach out and talk to us directly, share your personal story, your profile, and get an assessment from the experts to find out about next steps and your chances of admissions success. So the focus is on INSEAD, London Business School, and HEC Paris, as I said. And what a great team that I'm going to be spending the next 60 minutes with. We have Caroline Diarte Edwards. Caroline is a co-director at Fortuna, and she was formerly the INSEAD Director of Admissions and Financial Aid. How many applications do you think you read, Caroline, during the 7 years that you were the gatekeeper in Fontainebleau?
Oh, many thousands. I'm not quite sure, Matt. I dread to think.
Well, with you, and we're joined by Emma Bond, another co-director who was a former LBS senior manager of MBA admissions. Emma, if you were looking at this sort of record-breaking application volume year, would you have been excited or a little bit anxious about the 12 months that lie ahead of you?
I think it would definitely be a combination of both. You know, a large number of applications gives you an even bigger pool of candidates to sift through, and, you know, more experiences to read about and to find. But I think also that the team at the different schools will be sitting there kind of with their eyebrows going up into their hairline and sort of keeping their fingers crossed that they manage to get through and hit all their deadlines. It'll be a tough year for them, but I know they will all rise to the occasion.
Right. They're sort of counting the days to the beginning of a new term, blended learning and virtual campuses. It probably will be. We're also joined by Brendan Kramp, who brings a very distinct experience to all of the work that he does as an expert coach at Fortuna, because of course, Brendan, you're both an MBA alum from HEC Paris, but also then combine that with NYU Stern. So you've got a perspective on both the top US and European business schools. You were also a former Director of Development at INSEAD. Now, we're going to be focusing on HEC Paris. as you think about the difference between US and European business schools, Brendan, you're always very mindful of bringing in that international dimension. And I think you'll be talking about this a little bit more, but that's something that HEC and the other top European schools are really looking to understand, right? That sort of global mindset.
Very much so. I'd say any candidates for those schools, especially as even since I went there, which was 10 years ago at HEC, it's changed even more and more to become, I think the last number I saw was 93% international at HEC. So it's a real focus for this current dean. And it speaks to the way that employers are looking for experience from certain candidates too, for that kind of global mindset.
Right. Well, we've seen, of course, application volumes to these top European schools that continue to climb as international applicants from all over the world perhaps hesitate with uncertainties around H-1B visas and the Trump administration. Of course, all of that may change, or it may go in another direction after the presidential election of November 3rd, but it's certainly going to be a very busy year for these top schools. I did mention all of the previous MBA essay masterclasses that the team at Fortuna have put together. So there are 3 that you can catch up on that are currently on the Fortuna YouTube channel for the M7 and the S7 schools. But we're going to jump in for everything about Europe and be looking at obviously how you approach this, your story, that personal narrative, and the essays that are part of a much bigger application as you're also approaching your recommenders, everything that you're sharing through your resume, your CV, and how all of these different parts fit. And of course, as we'll also be talking about, schools that have recently introduced video components as part of this application. We're going to start with INSEAD, and I'm going to turn to Carolyn. Carolyn, we often tease you because as a gatekeeper that kind of saw over 30,000 applications during your 7 years at the school. I mean, INSEAD, where Harvard has 1 essay, LBS, as Emma will remind everyone, just has 1 and then an optional essay, but INSEAD has, what is it, 7, 8? It's
Yes.
a monster of an application. That's down to you. Thank you very much for all of this.
I know. I should have thought about my future as an admissions coach and how much time I would spend poring over these essays with clients, but now
you've broken it down into the 2 sort of sides of all of those essays, and you know, on the screen right now we can see the career essays, and then we'll be moving to motivational essays, and perhaps, you know, where that brings in a more personal story. But take us briefly through the sort of things that INSEAD is looking to understand through those 4 career essays that everyone can see.
Yes. Yeah. And I think the good thing about the length here of the INSEAD application is that, you know, it really gives you a chance to tell your story in both in breadth and depth. And, you know, when I work with clients who are working on multiple applications, you know, they often sort of start the INSEAD application with great trepidation because it's such, you know, as you say, it's a bit of a monster to look at initially. But at the end of the day, they often feel that, you know, they're really proud of what they've submitted to INSEAD because they feel that they've had a chance to get their story across in all its different dimensions. And they haven't had to sort of leave out something that they feel is important to them. They feel that they've really had a chance to sort of lay out their life story, their experience, their future plans in a way that is truly reflective of who they are and what they want to do. So there are benefits to that length. And I think also, you know, as you say, there's a number of questions here. The good thing about that is, you know, they give you pretty clear signposts about what they're looking to hear from you. And, you know, in some ways that is easier than some other applications, such as the Stanford application, where it's quite open. Also the Harvard application, you know, that it's a very open question, and that can strike fear into the hearts of candidates when they sort of look at, crikey, you know, how do I start here? So I think with the INSEAD application, they give you very clear signals about what they're looking for. And that's helpful, I think, especially for a diverse applicant pool of candidates where, you know, people are coming from very, very different backgrounds, very, very different perspectives. And so, you know, it takes some of the guesswork out of what the school is looking to learn from you in the application. So I think, you know, that's the positive side of the length here. And so, you know, as you said, there's sort of 2 sets of essays. There's these career essays, and then there's the motivation essays. And in the career essays, you know, they're looking to get beyond the facts and figures of your resume, of your CV. So the first question is just describe your current position. And it's really, you know, they're looking for a snapshot of what you're doing right now and a description that sort of lays out some of the context and the background so they can understand what it is that you're doing and, you know, your day-to-day responsibilities. And so, you know, it's very straightforward. You don't need to sort of second guess what they're looking for. And they give you some quite clear direction in that question, you know, suggested points that you can cover. If you have people reporting to you, you know, you should mention that. If you're managing a budget, you know, mention that, quantify things where you can. So, you know, it's pretty straightforward. And then, second question, what would be your next step? So they want to understand, what path are you on? What are your expectations in terms of how your career would evolve if you do stay with that company? So again, you know, it's pretty straightforward. And in many cases, you won't need those 200 words. You can mention what your expectations are as regards a promotion, when that might happen, you know, what that promotion would entail, the responsibilities and so on. And then question 3, probably the more interesting question of this set. So they're looking to get some insight into how your career has evolved over time. And, you know, the average INSEAD candidate, as you know, is often a little bit older, a little bit more experienced than the average candidate for the top US schools. So typically candidates have, you know, on average sort of 5 to 6 years work experience. And so they may well have had more than one job. They may, they've probably been promoted, and the school wants to understand that path and why you have chosen to follow that specific path. And so, you know, the key point here, I think, is the rationale behind the choices. So they want to understand, you know, what has motivated you to take those options. What is it that, you know, you have sought to get out of your career? What have you learned from that? And, you know, how have you progressed and why have you chosen to follow that particular path? So, you know, they can see the basic facts of your evolution on your CV. So you don't need to repeat those elements, but, you know, explaining the path, that's the important part of that question. And then there's the final question is about career aspirations. So, you know, what is your vision for your career when you graduate? Now, the tricky thing there is it's 100 words. It's pretty short. So you need to get to the point very quickly and state what you want to do. You know, what's your dream job post MBA? And then say something briefly about where you see yourself 10 years or 20 years down the line.
So, of course, what you've just done is said, well, there's Harvard with one essay that says, we've read the resume, we've read the letters of recommendation. What more should we know about you? Which, as you said, is this very open-ended and ambiguous question. Yeah. Whereas INSEAD has done us all a big favor and really broken things down. Yeah. But you know, with each of those, perhaps we can even talk about how you're then trying to capture the essence of that career development in just 300 words. Yes. Or even, you know, the reality is you'll have so many opportunities coming out of these top schools. And so as you talk about those subsequent plans, right. So your insights and advice focusing on those career essays and walking us through each of them.
Yes. Yeah. So the first 2 points, quantify and be specific. So, you know, in the career description, when you're describing your current career responsibilities, quantify things where you can, whether it's, you know, your budget, the number of people reporting to you, revenues that you've generated, number of clients that you're responsible for. You know, quantification really helps, and that's, you know, very true for that essay as it is for the CV. So keep that in mind, and be you know, clear as possible about what your responsibilities are. Don't just repeat what you've said in your resume, though. So you need to explain a bit of the context, and the context that you're explaining will depend on the role that you have. So, for example, if you're a consultant at McKinsey, you don't have to explain you know, what McKinsey is and what the, you know, usual job of a McKinsey consultant is. You know, they'll be very familiar with that. The file reader will have read thousands of applications from, you know, McKinsey, Bain and BCG applicants. So you can get very quickly into the nitty gritty of what it is that you do that's different from your peers. But if you work for a firm that's less well known, then you should certainly spend a bit of time in that, that career description, explaining, you know, what the company does. And keep in mind that if your company is not as well known, then you need to say a little bit more about the quality of your work experience. Because if you work at a blue chip firm, the school knows that, you know, you've been through a very rigorous recruitment process, and the quality of the work that is being thrown at you is of a very high level. And you'll have, they know a lot. They can make some assumptions about the quality of your work experience and the exposure that you've had. But if they don't know that firm, they can't make those assumptions. So you need to be very clear about the level of responsibilities that you've had, the impact that you've had, the exposure that you've had. So keep that in mind if you work for a company that may not be familiar to the file reader.
And just because you talk about that sort of going back and forth with the resume, with a CV, if already you'd indicated a bullet point that explained that you led a team of 8 I don't know, software engineers, are you trying to avoid that duplication, or is that
well,
something?
you can mention that, but if you tell a bit more of the story behind that. So I wouldn't just repeat, sort of convert bullet points into text, but if you're going to expand on that, if that's, you know, that essay is a great place to showcase perhaps a couple of your accomplishments. And so you can pick up on things that are in the resume, but just give a bit more context and expand upon that. Something else to be aware of is that later on you have an essay where you describe your key accomplishment, what you see as your key accomplishment. And so you don't want to be repetitive with that essay as well. So I wouldn't mention that particular accomplishment in this essay here, the career description. And something else to keep in mind is that, you know, you should avoid technical language, avoid jargon that the file reader might not be familiar with. So that's something to be careful about, because if you do have a technical role, those terms may be so normal and day-to-day to you and so obvious, but they might not be to a file reader. And you don't want to turn them off with language that they're not familiar with. So it's very useful to get feedback from someone who is not in your industry, to read that and let you know, is it crystal clear what you do, and have you avoided using language that might not be familiar to someone outside of that sector. And then something else that's of course very important to INSEAD is the international experience. So you should be looking to weave that in to your essays. And so, you know, if there is an international element to your current position, or also in the career evolution essay, then make sure that you hone in on those elements as well. That's really important to highlight.
Perhaps I mean, for example, on that point, a school that describes itself as the business school for the world, it has what, 92 nationalities across the September and January class starts. I mean, and this global mindset, and it's not just a week that you spent on a beach in southern Spain. It really is, whether it's through work, through your studies, through your background, and perhaps even your childhood, to really be able to demonstrate that global mindset. Now, perhaps you've never left your country, but you're still working in an international market, perhaps with an international client base. So there are many ways that you could portray that international dimension to your background.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, if your international experience is quite thin, then it's even more important to talk about the experiences that you have had in your essays. Because if you've had a lot of international experience, it will be quite evident in your CV, on your application forms. On the application form itself, you have to list your international experiences. So, you know, you should certainly include that in your essays, but you don't have to make such a big effort perhaps to highlight that above and beyond some other elements of your experience. But if you feel that your international experience is maybe less than, perhaps weaker than the average INSEAD student, and you know, as you know, the INSEAD student body is very international, and most people have spent considerable time outside of the home country and working or studying, then if you feel that you're on the that's a weakness for you, then certainly, you know, talk up all of those elements that you can that have an international nature. So as you said, you know, if you've got international clients or you're working in an international team, that's really important to highlight very clearly in these essays.
Right. Right. Now, your final idea is the sort of the thread of this story, and it ties past performance, even how that's a sort of a predictor of future success and achievements.
Yes, that's right. And so this can be a balance to strike, because I mean, most people are going to business school because they want to make a change in their career. So I mean, there are people who are looking to accelerate on their current path, but I would say the vast majority of candidates going to INSEAD are looking to make some change, and many of them will be making a quite dramatic change in their career. But you know, you need to show that your career vision is logical given what you've done in the past. And that can be challenging because, you know, now the career vision essay is only 100 words. It used to be more. So that's, you know, a very short statement. Doesn't give you a lot of time to go into great depth and detail. And so you need to show that, you know, what you want to do in the future is somehow building off some element of your experience in the past. And also, you know, it needs to come across as something that's authentic and genuine to you, something that you're really passionate about. And think about, you know, how you can give more context to those plans. It may be that, you know, you want to relate that vision to some other element of your application, whether it might link to something that you mentioned in your candidate description essay later on, or it might relate to, you know, maybe you have an entrepreneurial dream. Maybe right now you're also working on, you know, you have some entrepreneurial side interest that you'll be highlighting in another question, another essay in your application. So, you know, think about how you can make links with your, with other parts of your application, and how you can give some context to that career vision, because it's quite challenging with those, you know, just those 100 words to set out, you know, your plan for your entire career post MBA.
Right, right. Now, of course, at the end of this session, with the questions that we got coming in, we'll probably have this a bit like a game show, sort of quick fire, yes, no answers to some of the great questions. I will just introduce Jair's question from Peru, because I think it's very timely here. He looks at question 2 that says, well, what would you do without the INSEAD MBA? And then, of course, question 4 that says, where do you see yourself with the INSEAD MBA? And this idea of coherence, right? There's still the same essence of you in there, and being able to share that. Here are the opportunities I've had if I don't go to business school, but you know, the many paths that INSEAD might then open up. It just needs to make sense to the admissions office in Fontainebleau. Yes,
it does. And don't worry about that too much. You know, you need to show that, you know, you've got a coherent plan for your future, and perhaps INSEAD is not the only way for you to get there. So, you know, most people who are going to business school are on a successful track. And if they don't go to a specific school, that's not going to stop them dead in their tracks and stop them from achieving great things in the future. So you don't need to make it sound like, you know, if you don't go to INSEAD, then it's going to, you know, prevent you from achieving great things further down the line. But, you know, INSEAD needs to make sense given where you want to go. It needs to be a logical step in that path. So, you know, I wouldn't, the school doesn't dwell on that too much. They don't spend a lot of time looking at, so what are your post-MBA plans if you do have the MBA, if you don't have the MBA. They're more concerned about, you know, your path post-MBA and assuming you're going to pursue the MBA and what are you going to do with that, because that's their main concern. They also, I mean, another important point about the career vision is that they need to feel that the MBA is going to be of real value to your post-MBA career and that it's going to be a really useful stepping stone. And if they feel that you could achieve what you want to achieve without coming to INSEAD and without doing an MBA, then that's going to be a negative in your assessment, right? So you need to demonstrate that the MBA is, you know, it is a valuable stepping stone in that path. And that it's going to enable you to go through some sort of transformational process and open doors that otherwise might not be open to you.
Right. So with those video essays, leaning back and saying, if I don't get into INSEAD, LBS or HEC Paris, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. Let's quickly move on now to the more personal side of those INSEAD essays. Now, of course, they're very, very long, and anyone that's looking at this application will be able to spend more time. Perhaps we're just going to focus on the sort of insights of then sharing that personal narrative, and a self-awareness, I guess, right?
Yes, that's right. So, so these essays, so the first one is the trickiest one, the candidate description. So, describe yourself in 500 words. So that's often the question where people get a bit more hung up. The second question is an example of an achievement and an example of failure. All right, so we'll talk about some tips on how to tackle that, but that's fairly straightforward, right? What they're looking for. The third question, extracurricular activity. So what have you done outside of work and study? It's very straightforward. It's not long, it's 300 words, but they want to get a sense of what you have got involved in, past and also present. And so they're looking to get a sense for, are you a well-rounded person who has interests beyond study and beyond work? And that's also an indication of whether you're likely to be a student who will get involved in the life of the school outside of the classroom, which is a really important part of the program. And then the final question is an optional question. So it's just a space to provide additional information if you feel that there's something important to say which you haven't had an opportunity to say elsewhere in the application.
Now, I can give a candid description of some of the world's political leaders in just one word. 500 words seems very generous, but maybe I lack the reflection that is required.
Yes.
They're holding up the mirror to you here, right? A sense of self-awareness.
Yes, that's right. And so it's really important before diving into these essays to sort of take some time to take a step back and take stock of where you are. And think about, what are the factors that have driven your development and what has led you to be the person that you are today and doing the things that you're doing today. So that reflection is really critical, especially to that candid description essay. It's often a valuable process, and this is something that we work on a lot with our clients. And hopefully the admissions process will be a process where not only will you get into business school, but you also learn something about yourself. And that's something that, we really try to do with our clients, is take them through a process where, you gain some insight into your path and your aspirations for the future. And so, hopefully it's a great learning process as well as just some hoops to jump through. Now, as you mentioned, Matt, the candid description essay, they mention the word in there that they use is personal development. They don't say professional development. They specifically say personal development. And I think that's really critical to keep in mind. And sometimes, we have candidates who come to us who want a ding analysis, right? They've been rejected from a school and they want us to look through their application, give them some feedback on why they might have been rejected. And because often the schools, normally the schools won't give you any feedback. And it's not uncommon that in those applications for INSEAD, in that candid description essay, they have focused quite a lot on professional aspects. And that's really, to me, a missed opportunity, because you have plenty of space to talk about your professional accomplishments in other parts of the application. We've just been talking about, the 4 career questions, and as well as that, there's your CV, there's also the recommendation letters, etc., etc. So they get a lot of information about your professional profile. So take these motivation essays as an opportunity to tell your personal story, and especially that candid description. And you can go back to any point in time, right? You can talk about something that was, a big deal for you when you were a child. Maybe, I've seen stories of when people have, emigrated to a different country as a child, or someone who was a mentor to them as a child and really inspired them to follow a particular path. So you can really go to any point in time and think about, what are the key things that have influenced your development and have shaped the person that you are today. And in that candid description, 500 words is not a lot, so you can't say everything that there is to know about you in that one, essentially one page. So it's important to focus on typically sort of 4 or 5 themes, and you know, pick out some elements of your story where you've got a good story to tell and you've got a nice example to give that will illustrate some aspect of who you are, and perhaps, you know, create a memorable impression. And so, you know, often that essay ends up being the most interesting part of the application. And it's almost like, you know, a teaser, that they get a glimpse into some aspects of who you are and they want to learn more. And how do they learn more? They invite you to the interview. All right. So, you know, I think that kind of description essay is such a useful space to tell them about, you know, who you are beyond the facts and figures of your CV. And so, you know, you can also use professional examples in that essay. That's okay. But, you know, I would suggest focusing more on personal rather than professional examples. You know, another mistake that people make in these essays, and, you know, in the candidate description, they ask you to describe your weaknesses. And then in the next essay, you've got an example of accomplishment and an example of failure. And a mistake that candidates often make is sort of skating over that and trying to give examples of weaknesses that are actually disguised. They're actually really strengths, and they're just sort of disguising it as a weakness. And you know, the number of times I've read essays where they've given their weaknesses as things like, you know, I'm a perfectionist and I drive myself too hard, and, you know, I have my expectations of myself and other people can sometimes be too high. You know, it's just that it's so common to see things like that, and it doesn't always ring true. So, you know, some authenticity and honesty here goes a very long way. And with the example of failure in the second motivation essay, sometimes, you know, candidates are nervous about that part of the application, and, you know, they'll give a very sort of light example. You know, perhaps they, you know, miscalculated something in a presentation, and, you know, there was just it doesn't seem like a big deal or had any significant consequences. And actually the best candidates, and this can be somewhat sort of counterintuitive, the best candidates often have the most dramatic examples of failure. And, you know, maybe that's because those candidates are people who have taken a risk and they've stuck their neck out and they've pushed themselves, and it doesn't always go brilliantly, right? And so they've had experiences where, you know, they've learned a lot from a particular failure. And so a good example of failure is often, you know, quite a dramatic failure rather than an insignificant mistake, shall we say. So that authenticity and honesty, you know, they're not going to hold that against you. They want to see that you have some understanding of who you are, and, you know, your development opportunities, and no one is perfect. And they want to see that, that recognition and that acknowledgement, because if you're going to be a good MBA student, you have to be aware of your areas of growth, and you have to have this learning orientation, and that self-awareness is really critical to that learning orientation.
Right. So friends that have always told me that I was disingenuous and shallow, I always saw those as strengths. I guess I have to do a little bit more work. Well, let's stop there for INSEAD, because we're going to bring in London Business School and HEC Paris. Turning to you, Emma, Caroline has touched upon themes of fast-track professional development and maybe leading other teams. There's this whole ability for sort of authenticity and real self-awareness and reflection. I mean, I see that part of that as this chance to enjoy applying to business school. I know that it's very selective, but, you know, as you step back and think about all of those different qualities. Now, LBS has wrapped all of this up into 2 essays. So they want to know about post-MBA career goals and 500 words for those. And then an optional essay. That's it, right? So you guys are done after a couple of weeks reading all those thousands of applications. Take us through them. And of course, at the context, there are many other things that they're looking at. And then, you know, what the school is really trying to understand about the applicant.
Sure. Well, I was going to start off by saying take everything that Caroline's just said and put it into one essay and an optional LBS. And then yeah, I mean, I think the first essay, this essay has been around for a long time at LBS, and I think it's because it's tried and true. It asks you for three things, which is, you know, clearly what are your post-MBA goals? What experience have you had to this point in your career, and how is it relevant to those post-MBA goals? And then, of course, how will the LBS program itself contribute to you achieving those goals? So there are three very clear things that the team is looking for. And if you manage to answer those successfully, then you're a long way to providing, you know, the key information that they need from your application. I think with this first essay, where people can come unstuck is that it looks quite simple, and it is similar to some of the other schools that have, you know, quite a sort of standard, if you like, MBA question, but actually it's not. And if you don't spend the time sort of reflecting on yourself and your personal and your professional journey, then you can really come unstuck, and you know, you can end up with a sort of jumbled mess of information that's difficult to read. So
just
on
that point, Emma, and with all of the admissions experience, there's many thousands of applications, you know, in 500 words. Could you and colleagues, David Simpson, others, could you instantly tell if someone had you know, been through that sort of thought process and really made this essay about London business schools? Does it jump off the page?
Definitely. And, you know, there are a dozen different ways to write this essay. I think there are a couple that are easier than others. And one of the things I sort of want to talk about with this is structure and how to structure this essay. But yeah, definitely you can tell someone who's rushed, who's perhaps left it to the last minute, who's just kind of brain dumped onto the page, as opposed to someone who's really sat down, thought about their motivations, you know, their whole career path up to this point of application, and then really nutted out where they want to go sort of post MBA, and then a bit further down the track. And it's very clear, probably from the first paragraph, whether somebody's done it or not.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think Caroline talked about taking time to reflect, and that's definitely, you know, something that everybody should do before they start on the MBA journey. You know, you need to know your goals for this essay. You need to be very clear, as I said, exactly what you want to do, at least for the application process, what you want to do in the first couple of years after you graduate, but then also sort of a bit further down the track. So you can be looking sort of 5 to 10 years. And in doing that, you need to make sure that those goals stand up to scrutiny. So one of the things I sort of discuss with my clients is to look a bit further down the track and think about, if they get, you know, hopefully through to the interview process, the first question that you're going to get in almost any MBA interview is, you know, why are you doing an MBA? So if you haven't thought through and haven't clarified that with yourself before you start writing this essay, then, you know, you're going to get into all sorts of trouble. So it really is worth investing in the time before you start writing, and then it becomes much easier, and this whole process sort of is easier. In terms of framing, one of the things I think about sort of any essay is like a good picture. You know, a good picture deserves a good frame, and a good essay deserves a good frame. And that, again, links into this idea of taking time to think about what you want to say. For the LBS essay in particular, for this first essay, that sort of first paragraph is often the most difficult, and once that's sorted out, the rest tends to follow. But that should be an opportunity for you to really think about your motivations, you know, the why. If you want to go and be a management consultant, as so many people do post MBA, then, you know, why is that? You know, what attracts you about that career goal? If you want to start your own business, well then, you know, what's the personal driver behind that? And people once they have sat down and thought about it, can become much more impactful in what they say. So I think it's very necessary to take the time to frame that first paragraph, and then to think about, you know, how the rest of the information that you want to convey is going to follow.
And presumably in some of that sort of reflection and brainstorming, there might actually be certain ideas that you don't then commit to the 500 words of the essay, but could be incredibly valuable to you in that one-on-one discussion in an interview.
Absolutely, absolutely. And likewise, you know, you might think you know what you want to do, and then actually when you sit down and really reflect on the skills that your previous experience has given you, you might come to a position where you're thinking, actually, I think I want to do this, but perhaps I want to explore this area instead. And I had a similar situation to that with a client this week, where he thought at the beginning of our strategy call that he knew exactly how he was going to position himself. And then we talked it through and decided that actually there would be a bit of a switch in the way that he presented himself to the admissions committee, because that made for a more sort of linear career path and a more linear story, which is my sort of final point from this slide. And that is that an essay is a story. So your application as a whole is a story, and it should tell about you. And as Caroline said, you know, your professional achievements, but also your personal attributes and what you've achieved throughout the rest of your life. So it's about drawing a picture, painting a picture, telling a story, and creating a profile. And if you don't do that in a linear way that allows your reader to connect the dots, you're really doing yourself a disservice. So I think one of the things that people should remember is that sometimes when somebody from the admissions team is coming to your file, they will have read 25, 30 applications that day. And if they sit down and they get your essay and they have to work really hard to kind of follow the path that you're trying to tell them and follow what you're trying to say, they just switch off. I mean, you know, Caroline, Brendan, we've probably all done it at some point. You sit down and you found yourself reading, and then you find yourself zoning out and you have to go back and start again. And that becomes very frustrating for whoever's, you know, reading your file. So making sure that you connect the dots in a linear way, that you are drawing a fairly sort of linear path between your previous experiences and your goals. And then again, you know, how the LBS program will contribute to those goals. That's a really important thing.
So I guess Hollywood can pull it off with a Bruce Willis movie, and it's only right at the end you realize you've been watching a series of flashbacks. But this linear storytelling is as much then for the admissions readers. Someone has jumped in with how linear should it be, in the sense of, you know, are you recommending that first paragraph is about goals, and then second paragraph is about previous experience, and then the third paragraph, where LBS fits into all of that? Or is the more fluid? You said there are at least a dozen ways that you could approach this essay, so it's not one story fits all.
No, it's not, and it depends a bit about, you know, on what your story and experiences are. If you are looking to transition your career, so move from one industry to another, then your story is perhaps not going to be as linear as somebody who's just accelerating, who's, you know, coming in from finance and wants to stay in finance. And that's where you have to use your goals to showcase the skill set that you have, you know, so it's about linking always. It doesn't have to be, you know, I'm not saying you have to, you know, go sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, A, B, C, D, E, but you shouldn't be confusing your reader. You know, you shouldn't be making them work too hard to follow what you're trying to say and where you want to go. I do have a particular framework for these essays that I think tends to work particularly well, but, you know, it also depends on how comfortable people are with writing. You know, some candidates, some clients are fantastic writers. You know, they have a stronger liberal arts background and they find it really easy to sit down and nut out a 500-word essay. Some people look at it and that's just not something they do or haven't done for a long time, and it, you know, fills them with terror. So I think it depends a little bit, but I think whichever kind of path you go down and whichever structure you want to follow, taking the time at the beginning to really work it out and brainstorm and, you know, do your mind mapping or however, you know, whatever works for you, really makes a difference in the end result.
Well, I'm aware over the last 5-6 years you have the most unbelievable success rate with clients. So what you're doing, it works. I suppose it speaks to the extraordinary insider experience that you have at London Business School. So now we're looking at the post-MBA goals. Now we've got 500 words. How detailed should we be?
I think my main complaint about essays when I used to be reading these was, I used to say, I'd sit there and, you know, David and people in the office I'd be sitting there going, oh, so fluffy and so vague. And kind of fluffy writing drives me crazy. I think you have to be detailed, as Caroline said. You have to be clear on your immediate post-MBA, your sort of medium post-MBA, and as we've sort of discussed before, it doesn't, nobody's going to hold those to you. It's about sort of knowing for the purpose of the application what you want to do, or at least what you think you want to do, and then the MBA itself can be a time of real exploration. But you need to show your motivation. You need to perhaps do your research and think about the particular role that you might want and the particular companies that you might be targeting, the geography that you're interested in, and then sort of reference these in an intelligent way as you go through the writing process. But one of the things Caroline mentioned, and I would like to reiterate, is that not everybody, not your reader, won't necessarily know your industry with as much detail as you do. And even after sort of gulp and you say 20 years in the industry, I still talk with clients and I have to get them to go over with me again, exactly the kind of niche industry knowledge that they have, and explain it to me, because even having read all these thousands, I still don't know everything about investment banking or everything about anything else, So it's about being detailed, but about remembering your audience.
Right. I'm still getting someone to make sense of cryptocurrencies for me, but it's probably better that I don't know. It's also about being selective, right? Because there are so many things that you could say, and you want to have impact in what you then choose to share. Yeah,
absolutely. The same way as INSEAD, LBS is a very international school. So, it's about sort of knowing your school, finding out what kind of attributes and skills that your particular school is looking for, and then going back, sort of rifling through that drawer in your brain where you have all your prior experiences and your different examples, and saying, which example can I pull out, which A, shows the skill that I'm trying to put across, whether it's leadership or, sort of ability to do well in international teams, or problem solving, or decision making, or whatever it is, and finding the example that demonstrates that, but also an example that's relevant to where you want to go, because this essay you have to keep connecting back. Don't give an experience that doesn't have anything to do with your post-MBA dream, because it then creates a disconnect in your writing. So it's not about just dumping everything you've done in the previous 5 years. That's in the data form with all the information on your current role and your previous role, so that will all have been covered. It's about choosing, one or two really distinct career highlights and showing what you've learned from those and how they will impact where you want to go. But I think the next point, again, sort of comes back to structure, but this idea of balance with this essay. So, sort of roughly, in my ideal framework for this essay, roughly kind of 45% would be sort of framing it and on your goals and on your past experiences. The very latter 45% is on LBS and research and saying why the school is right for you. But then in the middle, I think it's quite important to sort of have a linking paragraph or a few sort of lines that talk about, yes, I've done this. Yes, I want to do this. Yes, LBS is great and this is why it resonates with me. But also, what are the gaps that you have? What skills are you currently missing that you need an MBA to fill? And if you can sort of follow that path through, you're taking your reader with you, and it then should sort of connect up quite nicely. One of the things that I do sometimes find with clients is they spend a lot of time on goals and a lot of time on experience. And then, they'll give me this sort of weedy little paragraph at the end on why the LBS experience helps. And it's just not enough. You need to spend some time really, showcasing your knowledge of the school. But that again is something that needs a lot of research. It needs a lot of time. A lot of outreach. One of the things we work with clients is obviously telling them how they can connect with schools, and in the days of Corona it's a little bit more difficult. You can't hop on a plane and go and visit the campus in London, so you have to really get online and do the LBS webinars that they have available. You have to reach out through your network and make connections and find out what other people can tell you about the school, and obviously there are no excuses nowadays. again, apart from coronavirus, but there is so much information out there, and it's so easy to connect with people through, you know, email and Zoom and everything else, that if you haven't done your research and you can't really sort of prove to the admissions committee that you know what the school is like, and you've thought about the curriculum and the classes and things you want to do, and the extracurricular kind of clubs that resonate with your career goals, then again, you know, you're sort of letting yourself down.
I'm going to take you to the final part of this, which of course is the optional essay, and I think your bullet point says everything. How optional is optional?
Yeah. So I know from Fortuna colleagues that some of the other schools that we work on who have optional questions don't necessarily, you know, it's not as necessary to do this. I tend to think that because LBS only has that one major essay, if you don't do the optional, you're doing yourself no favours. I think that it's a perfect opportunity to find something else that's missing from your application and to really showcase that. So whether it's a startup that you've been involved with, and you know, it might have failed, might have bombed tragically, but you will have learned something from it, whether it's how you've overcome adversity, or you know, a particular challenge in your life, and that could be professional, but for this it's perhaps nice to show something, you know, outside the workplace, because the first essay does focus more on the professional side of things. If you have, you know, taken a leadership role in some kind of volunteer association and spent a lot of time in that and really made a difference, it's literally a sort of perfect opportunity to take advantage of that. So I tend to think that if people don't take the time to do that, it's a little bit lazy. And sometimes, you know, if people are rushing to submit at the last minute, that might be why. So I would always recommend that people take some time to do the optional. Having said that, you know, you're not going to be 100% penalised if you don't do it. You know, it is definitely optional, but I just think there's optional and optional, and this is a probably should do optional as opposed to I really won't because I can't be bothered.
Right. And then mini essays, because there are those formal questions, but equally within the biodata application form, lots of other opportunities to share your story and where business school fits at this point.
Sure, and this is a really often overlooked aspect of the LBS essays, you know, the official sort of essays, and we do look at Caroline's application and Brendan's and the other schools who have these huge raft of essay questions. But actually, if you go into the data form for LBS, there are a number of 300 and 400 word questions that look at your international experience. That one's only 100 words, which is actually really tricky to find something meaningful to say, you know, with an experience, and then what you've taken away from that experience and how it's sort of impacted you. To do that in 100 words is really quite tough. There's a section on extracurricular, so that's 300 words or 400 words, I think. So, you know, if you don't take the time to think about those additional aspects of your application, you're not giving a holistic profile. So that's, you know, what they want to see. But you're also, you know, don't leave that till the last minute. They take time, and they are just as important in terms of rounding out your application as the actual formal sort of main essays. So yeah, they are just questions on a form, but effectively they become like mini essays, and they can do either a huge amount of good for your application or a huge amount of damage if you don't take the time. So yeah, something to think about when you're looking at LBS and thinking, oh, it's easy, I can just rip off a 500 word essay in a couple of days. If you leave that till the day before you submit, then you're probably going to be in trouble.
So the one bullet point I feel that we should add to this is, you know, Emma Bond says, don't do fluff. And if Emma says it, then she really means it. Now, I'm sure there was no fluff, Brendan, in your application. I always think it's daunting to go third on a panel when you've got, you know, all of your colleagues and these wonderful experts that capture so many insights. But HEC Paris, of course, takes or introduces some fascinating additional elements to their essays. Of course, we start with, you know, where the MBA program fits at this stage, your professional objectives. But I look forward to talking to certainly essay number 5 and the different options that you have for that one. Talk us just a little bit through these first 3 essays that we have on the screen right now.
Yeah, I think the thing that's actually fun to work on the HEC applications when I'm working with applicants is it is pretty diverse, the questions that they ask. And they cover a lot of the same ground that Caroline mentioned and Emma in the applications, but in a different way. So it doesn't break into kind of career questions only or motivation. You'll see it's kind of peppered throughout the questions in different ways. And what I think is really eclectic about what HEC does is they're really, you can see from some of the questions, they're trying to get at what is the heart of who you are? How do you think? What appeals to you? What are your likes, your dislikes, these kind of things. And there's some open-endedness purposely in the questions. And the point of that is to see, okay, so where do you take this? You know, kind of a little bit of a test of your entrepreneurialism, you're dealing with ambiguity is, this is an open-ended question, you have a choice in it. So which do you take, why, and how do you explain that? And I mean, for me, that's kind of fun. You know, it's not just a rote application. I know that sends some people into a real tizzy. So that's how we work with them. But starting with the first one here is, I think that what's really key about this question is why are you applying for the MBA program now? Of course, what's the professional objective that will guide you? But there's this part that a lot of the candidates I work with kind of shoot over at, or I don't think that they quite understand the import of it at first, is how will the HEC MBA contribute to the achievement of this objective? So it's why now, and how specifically is the MBA going to switch you from point A to point B, or is it making up for a lack that you haven't had in your past experience? Is it going to give you an opportunity to go abroad? You haven't had that in your professional or educational experience before. There's a real opportunity here to have a reason for yourself and in your career, and to make sure that you take the three parts of this question and really do some deep thinking on them before you do the essay, and then make sure that it's not just that you think you have to do an MBA, or other people at your age are doing an MBA. That might even be a motivation for why you're considering it. But as you really think about your life plan and your career, there's probably going to be a reason why an MBA will get you to a certain place, and then why HEC is exactly that right program. And the more that you know about the program and the kind of things that it enables you to do through its partnerships, through its concentrations and things like that, then you can really work on how that fits into your career trajectory as well. So that's a key part there. The next question is really looking at kind of the overall, your slide just disappeared there.
I think we may have lost Matt for a moment. So why don't you carry on speaking, Brennan? If Matt isn't back in a moment, then I will share the presentation from my screen.
Sure, okay. So the next question is really looking at, what do you consider your most significant life achievement? And whenever I'm working with candidates on this, I really encourage them to think broadly. So I've worked with candidates that spoke about the birth of their first child and just what an amazing, life moment that was in their family and their building. I've spoken to candidates where we looked at really a longer trajectory in their life, which was moving from their country of origin and leaving at a relatively early age at 17 without their parents, without friends, moving to a new country where they didn't know the language, but taking an educational or a professional opportunity. And that, that kind of arc is a big achievement. So this doesn't have to be just one little honed thing from your career. It can be, certainly. And the real key to this is describing, so why was this the most important achievement? What is it about it? What stood out for you? What did it involve in terms of personal challenge? And what kind of effect did it have on the creation of your character? I think that's the key point, is if you look at each of these essays for HEC, we're really kind of like Emma said, we're telling a story about you as a whole person. Where does each part fit in that the admissions committee is going to see really creates you as an overall candidate, your overall ambitions and things like that. The slide is advanced one, so I wonder if you can go back so I can see the question. It got ahead of me. There we go. So the third one here, the leadership and ethics. This is a really, really tricky question for a lot of candidates, and it's really fun to work on. I think the instinct that a lot of people, when they're working on this at first, is to say, I came across an ethical question. There was a clear right and a wrong. I chose the right path. I'm going to tell you how I'm ethical, and we're good. You know what I mean? Which is not a very interesting essay, and it's really not reflective of how real life goes. So ethics are complicated. If you even think about something, so I worked with a great candidate who had been involved in the oil and gas business in North Dakota here in the US. And part of his remit was being responsible for a team that had to go and do quite intensive work in the field that was not always safe. And depending on the information that they were sent, weather, the pumps, all kinds of different things, that could have an effect on whether someone's life is in peril, right? But that doesn't mean that he always had the information he needed, and there were timeliness. So talking about that ethical question, and yet he had his deliverables, was fascinating. I learned something about that industry. I learned about how he had to parse that, how he had to check with his management, what he would feedback. That was a fantastic essay and really showed grappling with those kind of questions, how it's not black and white, how he didn't always feel comfortable with it. And a really great thing that he added in an extra essay is, inspired by that moment himself, he formed a safety group that didn't even exist in his company. And so he got, kind of heads of different departments to talk about, we're all facing this. Sometimes, time pressures are what they are, this and that. How can we better coordinate so that that doesn't become the kind of question or the kind of issue that we don't want to have? And that was a really good lead in for that. So the more that you can think about how those questions come up in your life or in your career, I think the better.
And it's a great question. It will give Sarah and Benoit and the rest of the admissions team at HEC Paris a real sense of you, whether that's in that MBA study group or just, the sort of experience, the thinking, that moral compass that you're bringing. For me, it shares, we've talked in some of these webinars about the white space on a person's resume, bullet points that capture so many things, whether it's at the Big Four, MBB, the investment bank. But these sort of life experiences, and of course, maybe not one right or wrong answer, but just your thought process and how you handle it. It's certainly that candidate then delivered a great example. So you've sort of framed it in terms of this vision that you have for your life. There are lots of essays. That's actually an opportunity. That's not a punishment. And how you're then breaking each one of them down, for a different facet of your story. So as you think about those sort of key takeaways for the audience that's with us today, you say, well, ask yourself these questions. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, and I think you really hit the nail on the head when you talk about what's your process of thinking. So there's no particular right answer that's being looked for, but it's how did you come to this conclusion? What is the thinking? What is the awareness, the global awareness that you've brought to it? So there are a lot of essays. I think it's a strength because it really allows you to shine and show different parts of yourself and your candidacy. This is repeating what I said a little bit, but really ask yourself, why do I need an MBA now? Because the more that you really answer that question for yourself is going to make that essay that much easier. It's going to become clear, okay, I'm at this point in my life, in my career. If I do this MBA, here's what it's going to give me. Here's what I intend to explore. And then it kind of opens up also this question of, okay, so what am I really after in terms of my career, both right after an MBA and in the longer term? This isn't to say HEC is going to hunt you down in 20 years and say, you said in such essay, you were going to be this. It's not that at all. We all change, and that's part of the program. But having that clear vision when you go in is really important, and making sure that it's rational. It's, it's not, Brendan, in 2 years after I'm going to be the CEO of, GlaxoSmithKline, because I know that, this has to be realistic, put together, and is a real clear trajectory that with these skills and experience that you're going to advance in that direction that you're going. I'd mentioned this before, but it bears repeating, that think deeply about the big questions. That most significant life achievement, a lot of people, I feel like they think that they have to talk about some big win in their business, some big client they brought on. Sometimes those are great essays, but this is really a broad question asking, what is your life achievement? And so think big on that. This is your entire life here. If the thing that you choose is, winning that last sales pitch, that's great, but why in your life is that the one? Or more directly, like the example I gave of the first child for that couple, just what that represented to them as a family and what they were going to do with their lives. And he actually integrated that really well into his career and talking about providing for a family and the kind of family he wants to have and things like that. So it was pretty beautiful. Avoid this kind of speaks to what I said before about the ethics, but avoid trying to look perfect, because nobody is. And the ethics will come up in your career in all kinds of different ways. I know that when I applied, I had to speak about, I was a fundraiser for many, many years in international fundraising and being put in very difficult situations by very influential donors who had a lot of money and made a big difference in the organizations I worked for, but they weren't necessarily asking for the things that were in the organization's interest. And so that was a constant thing that every day I was dealing with in some way, and drawing that out to say, there's always going to be a balance here between organizational and donor, and figuring that out early is probably, a good thing.
Right. Now, Caroline had talked about authenticity and honesty for INSEAD. Emma, of course, talked about no fluff. Again, this idea, applicants have it in their minds, you know, I must shine, I must, you know, obviously put your best foot forward, but that they sometimes boil that down to this idea of looking perfect, and it doesn't work, right? I mean, we're more rounded and more flawed. I mean, Shakespeare had us nailed 400 years ago. And for the admissions office, presumably that's the real beauty, to get that more rounded sense of you.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, just to that point that you're saying, that the imperfect, I remember working with Caroline, we were working with an applicant to the school who had been very honest and authentic about some of the negative feedback she received. Is she's a real performer. She was hitting all of her targets, but a bunch of her team resigned all at the same time. And they really give the feedback that you just push us too hard. This is not doable. And she was honest about that. You know, it was kind of a shock to her that this all happened, and she'd come back from a long vacation and this all happened. But by putting that in there, it really showed she'd done the reflection. She saw where there were the flaws, and that when she pushed herself to this extreme, when you do that to a team sometimes, especially if they're not rewarded, that's not going to work, right? So it showed someone that had done the deep thinking on that, was really looking to advance themselves as a leader, as their profession. And so it read really well.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, of course, HEC INSEAD is not alone in how many essays that they have, and you've also, we're going to take a look at 4 through 6, and I do love number 5.
Yeah.
But you know, that they use the word imagine. That there is a lot of room for imagination and creativity in how you respond to all of these essays. Talk us through them.
There is. There's a lot of room in this, and like I said before, no right answers, but in the answers that you make it clear why you're answering the way you are and what's important to you, what stood out for you. So this number 4, imagine a life entirely different from the one you now lead, and what would it be? The key to thinking about this is really thinking, okay, who are you at your core? Because a lot of our values and the things that shape our personality don't change so much if we take ourselves into another circumstance or environment, etc. Of course, those are, you know, affect us in some way, but who are you at the core, and what would that be like to be you in a completely different situation? So even when I did this, you know, I was involved, I lived in London, I lived in Paris, I lived in DC, I was in international fundraising. But when I did this, I imagined myself as a Midwest farmer in the US. What would what would that look like for me? And, you know, questions of sustainability have always been important to me. I would still be really driven to hit targets, because that's just something I always did, and kind of lets me know I'm on the right scale. I also really like the landscape. The Midwest, I find it really peaceful, you know, kind of like I would have more than my studio box in studio or in Paris. So I just really thought, so what would that life be like? Who would I be that would be kind of similar? What other opportunities, and what would that life look like for me? And working with other candidates, they've really taken this in some really fun, interesting ways. You know, I just worked with a candidate who, she is based in Canada, but she is on the board of an organization that helps with microfinance in Africa. So she really had a lot of knowledge about what a life like that could look like. That's not her life, but she imagined herself in that life, you know, and drew that out. There's a lot of ways you can go with this, super creative. Again, in those themes that Caroline brought up, Emma brought up, international thinking, global, here's where you can put it. I mean, imagine a life entirely different. Where do you put yourself? You know, especially if you've only maybe been in your home country or 2 countries or something like that. What do you know about other places, and how do you think about them? This question 5, I often get from people saying, what's the right one to choose? What's the right one to answer, you know? And you know, what appeals to you and why? It really comes back to your heart and your mind of which one of these I would say jumps off at the page for you, and why. Each of them can be really a fun question to respond to and find a great you know, kind of example for. I would say one pitfall I would give advice on is on C, what figure do you most admire and why? A lot of people, I think, feel that they have to choose a really famous person or a famous business person. Whereas some of the really best essays that have been so authentic, I remember one I worked with a candidate, and she picked a community leader just in her community that, you know, none of us would have known that name or anything about that, but what this person had achieved in bringing the community together and really transforming some of the things that were affecting them in terms of crime, transportation. There was some homelessness going, and it was a true leader, a true community level leader that this person really seen, look at what they did just with so little, and really admire that aspect, and then wants to take that to this level of, I'm going to do my MBA internationally. I want to go this place in my career. And they had a really purpose-driven career in the medical field. So it really fit in that way too. I'd say some of these others, you know, a first-time visitor to your country, to discover. What a great question. There was one that Caroline and I worked with, a candidate that wrote about Penn Station in New York, which if you've been to Penn Station is really not pretty, really not a great place, but used it as this amazing jumping point to show, because of what was done to Penn Station, the beautiful station that used to be historic, that is the reason that Grand Central Station was preserved. So the outcry, because of what happened in Penn Station, allowed Jackie Onassis and all these kind of, luminaries to get on board, and they saved Grand Central. And Grand Central, I didn't know this, is now the most visited tourist site in New York to date. So it's, that architecture, the photographs that happened from there. So he did this really beautiful thing about tying in, this one thing that was actually destroyed led to this whole movement of preservation in a country and in a city that's not necessarily known for historic preservation, right? We're not London, we're not Paris. So I thought that was a really good awareness. And he had a lot of links, he was American by birth, but had a lot of links with France, and kind of doing some of the play-by-play with the train stations in Paris and stuff like that was really great. The books.
Now, with each of those examples that you've given, it's not the time that they then spent on that particular monument, that particular book or movie, or the person that you admire, but it's the thinking that lies behind it, right? We're trying to sort of show perhaps what our thought process is. These are the clues that the admissions office, the insights they're really looking for.
Exactly. And if you just think about how much more interesting that is to read than to say, history is important to me, or I like history, versus an example like that and something that you're involved in your awareness. It's just, such a great illustration, and showed a real awareness of his city and what he loved about his city and where he lived. I'll talk about number 6 here in the kind of the way that Caroline and Emma did too. Is there any additional information you'd like to share with us? They give a lot of space here, the 900
words, that's a lot.
Yeah, and so it's, how optional is optional. They don't even talk about this as optional, even though it is. But what I would say in this, and has been really useful and kind of like successful in working with candidates, is if there's any part of your application where you felt there was a weakness, something you didn't get to explain enough. Often I've worked with a lot of candidates where maybe on their GMAT, they didn't come in on their quant as high as their day-to-day experience in banking or whatever their field is would reveal. So we talk about some of the really hard quant that they're going through in their day-to-day and what they have to perform on. Some others have had maybe a slightly lackluster academic performance in their college, but then they made up for it with classes as a professional. So we talk about that. There's been a lot of people where there've been different things that have happened as they're international. So there would be maybe gaps on the resume, or 1 year when they switched schools, which was a bit tough, but they were coming from a completely different culture, different language. There's a great story behind that wouldn't just be available in your transcripts. And I'd say this is the perfect spot, especially when you do some really, critical thinking around, what do I want to communicate here? This isn't to say, woe is me, or I'm a victim. It's to say, this is what I'm really capable of. I can show it in this and this way. If you look at my transcript or this, you might not see that, but I'd like to draw your attention to, it's a really kind of like mature, great way to kind of reorient things if something might look off in an application. I like to restate here 2 parts of the global and international thinking that might not have come across in other parts of the essay if it's relevant. Sometimes it's just from the resume, it's really clear, or the jobs and stuff like that. And sometimes it's not as clear from the background. So this is a great place to work some of that in if it hasn't been foregrounded already.
Got it. Now on the next slide, you have sort of summarized a lot of that advice. I'm going to flip some of the points that you've made. You said there's no one right answer. So could there be a wrong answer? Choosing the wrong person, choosing the wrong movie, the wrong experience to share?
I would,
or is it a wrong approach?
Yeah, I'm going to say there's lesser right answers. I'd say there's ones that are less effective. Let's put it that way. But certainly, if you go in some of those examples I gave of trying to give an example of an ethics where you just chose the right one and you were perfect and it was all buttoned and tied up, that's going to read as inauthentic, right? And so it's going to be kind of wrong in that sense. Or if you're talking about why the MBA now and what are the choices that are going to guide your career, and you don't really have a vision for that, and maybe it's just that you just want to be promoted or something, but you haven't thought through the distinctions, that's going to read very quickly. You have to give that deep thinking of really why HEC, really why the MBA now. Do you really need it? What is it going to do for you, and have you researched it? So there's ways that just comes across, and I'm sure from all the applications that Caroline and Emma have read too, that it becomes clear automatically. So there's no there's no way to kind of skip that going in depth about yourself and really doing some of the thinking on your personal story. I'd say for the entirely different, life, that might be a different career, country, lifestyle, like I put there, think again, broadly and kind of very differently than thinking, okay, I'm a banker, and maybe a different life would be I was a lawyer or something like that. That might be a little too parallel or in the same city. It comes out better if you think about something that is truly a different life, and they're really trying to get at that. This is a little bit of repeat of what I said too, but the open choice questions really are an opportunity for you to show why you're picking something, what's important to you, and how you think around that. HEC again and again in its literature, in its presentations, talks about leadership, internationalism, critical thinking, thinking outside the box. They have a very strong entrepreneurship fostering on campus. That's a big part of what they're doing too. And their strategy work is really important to them too. So think through all those things that are important to the school, and when you're answering some of those questions and how that links in.
Now with that one, I'm just going to draw in comments that Emma and Caroline, of course, have made about know your school. And, with Fortuna, we talk about, well, of course, you could find alumni that are in Minnesota, that are in Manchester, that are in Minsk that you could talk to. That would be very helpful. But you talked about the entrepreneurial mindset, different aspects of the LBS program. So it's also then perhaps finding someone who was the president of the entrepreneurship club, or individuals that have contributed in a way to the school. I mean, these are great ways to be able to show the schools that you've really got to know them, right?
I think you're exactly right. And I've seen a lot of really good candidates and really good applications where they've reached out to alumni that are very available, through LinkedIn or other means, and the admissions team at HEC is well putting them in touch with. And from those conversations, what comes back, particularly when we're working with candidates, is very specific and authentic things that they discover that they didn't read about on the website. So they might have talked to the head of the, finance and marketing club or something like that, or to the luxury club, and said, oh, they did this trip to LVMH. And during that, they learned that one of the things they're looking for from candidates is to have an experience through language and cross-cultural and blah, 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 and they can put that in there, and it's very authentic. And it's something that they wouldn't have just read elsewhere that other candidates might, be rabbiting as well. So it's important to have those conversations and to really figure out what a fit that is for you.
Right. Now, as we bring it all together, and your final slide then points to this example of discussions with alumni, with admissions. You also bring up some of the other aspects. I mean, LBS has 15-month, 18-month, as well as the 2-year options. INSEAD, Fontainebleau, alliances with Wharton, all sorts of different things. You also just bring to people's attention some of the other aspects of a program, which again, presumably speak volumes about the time that you've taken to identify the great fit that HEC Paris would be for you.
Absolutely. And I'd say just 2 things I'd really like to highlight from this are that clear, realistic thinking about your post-MBA career. There's a wealth of information on their site about the kind of companies that recruit from HEC, the kind of tracks that a lot of alumni have taken. And you don't have to shoot yourself, way into the stars right after the MBA. Think realistically of, this will give me a leg up or a change or whatever opportunity, but then use that to think, okay, in 5 years and plus on that, the more that you articulate that, the more real that sounds and clear. And the admissions committee really sees that there's some mature and realistic thinking. And then I did put that point there about the study abroad partnerships and internships. HEC has done a lot in recent years to form links with NYU that it already had, Hong Kong, Yale. There's all these kind of opportunities with LBS that's part of their program. And so if that appeals to you and also would make sense in your career trajectory, I would say to make sure that you highlight that in your application.
Got it. Great. Now, our next slide shares with you the admissions deadlines for the 3 schools. Of course, INSEAD and HEC both have a September and a January class start. These are for the September 2021 class starts already. And just very quickly from each of the 3 of you, I mean, INSEAD's deadline is what, 3 weeks away, Caroline? So, I mean, is it the be all and end all, or taking the additional time? There's still plenty of places left in round 2, even in round 3.
Yes, absolutely. So if you haven't started work on your application, I would not submit for round 1. Round 2, round 3 is absolutely fine. Round 4 may be better avoided for more common profiles, especially in such a busy season, as you said, Matt. It is going to be, you know, there is certainly a surge of applications. So I would suggest applying in the first 3 rounds rather than round 4. But beyond that, then just apply when you're ready and you've had time to, you know, give some careful thought to your application and go through that reflection process that we talked about. So unless you are well down the line with your application, at this stage, or unless you've got a huge amount of free time over the next few weeks, then I would say target round 2 now rather than round 1.
Got it. And LBS similarly with 4 rounds of admissions. Now, of course, you're then waiting until January, but would your advice be very similar, Emma?
Yeah, absolutely. And the main thing is really that you put the best application forward that you can. And if you haven't done anything yet, you know, then getting it all together by September the 11th is going to be a little bit tricky. The January 5th deadline at round 2 is traditionally the really big bumper round. So you know, there's a big break between round 1 and round 2. So if you're watching this now, and particularly if you've already done GMAT, then there's really, you know, a good idea to try and hit that January date, because it, you know, you've got still all of the autumn and fall to work through. So yeah, but otherwise much the same. If you're shooting for round 4, it's April next year. You know, the class does start to get tight by then, and you have to have a good strong profile, or be a Brit. They tend to apply late. So
yeah, what is that? They figure they just need an Oyster card to get into central London. But just one question on that, because of course sometimes candidates will say, oh, but you know, I'm in this really well represented either, you know, professional subset or demographic subset, and therefore I feel compelled to apply early. But I mean, ultimately applying early but failing to stand out in that subset isn't going to do you any favors either, is it, Emma?
No, not at all. And that's the point always, about making sure that you are presenting yourself in the best possible light. And if it takes you that extra month or so to really pull your application together and to really take that time to reflect on yourself and, you know, pull out those strands of your application that can make you shine, then it's worth waiting.
Great. And for rolling admissions, Brendan, of course, that means that the school's responding in a sort of a 2 to 4, 5-week time frame. Does that put emphasis on applying early, because obviously they're slowly filling up the places, and it's a very competitive, very selective program?
It is, yeah. I think what's interesting with HEC is not only does it have 2 intakes a year, but then has this rolling. So you actually have quite a quick feedback once you apply, which is nice. You hear back from them quite, you know, quickly, and then if there's interviews and things like that and a decision. I have witnessed the same as what Emma was saying. There tends to be a group that really applies quite late in the rounds for that intake. So, you know, waiting for the 2nd or the 3rd or something like that to the end. And I think it works better if you do plan earlier, because they look to fill up certain spots for that round. And then you don't know what you're dealing with in terms of what their availability is, you know, as you wait in those future rounds. But what it can be nice is if you feel that you're rushing to try and make up the deadline for a certain intake, you always have that next intake. So if it's a matter of getting a great application and waiting a couple months versus submitting it now, that's what I would recommend. Right.
Great. Now, for all of this and talking through each of your individual stories where business school fits, whether it's INSEAD, London Business School, HEC Paris, or other top schools, you know, do feel free to talk through your own stories. We've talked about ethics, we've talked about leadership, we've talked about international mindsets, to be able to, you know, find out from former admissions experts how that really weighs up and how the schools might be able to look at that. So you can sign up for a free 30-minute consultation with the experts at Fortuna. That's on the website. I promised some questions from the audience, but I've been peppering them in as we go. Just a quick one that's come up from a couple of the viewers about reapplying. If you're reapplying to the schools, Caroline at INSEAD, are you then going through the same application and facing the same essays? Or is there anything additional or different that you would bring in?
Yeah, it depends when you're reapplying, you know, the elapsed time since your initial application. So the best thing to do is to contact the school and ask them for the reapplication guidelines, because it varies according to that amount of elapsed time. So the important thing to keep in mind as a reapplicant is that you need to show evolution, right? So if you apply with exactly the same application, exactly the same profile, you know, no change since last time, you're going to get the same decision. All right. So So it's important to show that you have evolved, that you've grown as a candidate, that you've perhaps taken on board and understood what your weaknesses were, and you've sought to address those. So you know, that reflection, again, coming back to the reflection, that's super important.
My final question for you, Emma, again, having read applications, of course, these top schools are looking at GMAT and GRE scores, they're looking at GPA, of course, all of these other data points, letters of recommendations. We've got lots of material on the Fortuna website talking about all of those other aspects of applying to business school. But in your experience, and you know, as senior admissions at London Business School, did you ever read essays, sort of put them down at the end and say, well, wow, I have to meet this person? You know, can essays really make that much difference?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, a really strong essay that gives you really good insight into the candidate is, you know, is so important. And because you have to lift yourself off the page, you have to make the person reading think exactly that. You know, we have to interview them because I really want to see what they're like in person. And if you've done that at the end of a really good essay, then, you know, you've achieved at least a good part of the process. And that comes back to, you know, all the things that we've all been talking about, but particularly treating it as a journey, learning about yourself, getting that down on paper, making sure you answer the questions. And obviously for LBS, not so many, for HSC and INSEAD a lot more. But yeah, definitely. And it's such a great feeling to read an essay like that, because you know the candidates put thought in, you know that they could be a really, really impactful student. And it's a nice feeling when you do get an essay like that in front of you.
Right. So thank you to all of our viewers. What Brendan, with great modesty, didn't share, I know that he secretly wants to be a farmer in the Midwest, but he's also an extraordinarily talented artist in the Midwest. And we look forward to shows at the Saatchi Gallery and elsewhere that are planned once COVID is perhaps behind us and you're able to travel. You're the poet and the quant, as our partners like to think about it. With Poets and Quants, we organise the Centre Court MBA Festival, which brings together the likes of Virginie Fougier, the admissions director at INSEAD, David Simpson, Emma's former colleague, head of admissions at London Business School, Sarah Benoit, and other admissions team members from HEC Paris. In fact, I think we have just about every world top business school, Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, they all join in, and it's great to be able to hear from those gatekeepers. So do join us for that later in October. We'll also be having a special event to focus on the Masters in Management. One of you had asked about these top schools being able to apply straight out of college. INSEAD LBS don't offer that sort of 2+2 option that Harvard and other M7 schools have. But the Masters in Management, of course, is a great opportunity. And with the Fortuna team, lots of experience to help you to put together your story, whether it's for the MBA, the Executive MBA, or those pre-experience Masters in Management. We thank you for staying with us. I know there was a ton of great advice. And thank you, of course, to my three panelists that have shared so much insight in the last 90 minutes. I didn't see the time go. Check out this webinar if you only caught the last part of it. It'll be available on Fortuna's YouTube channel in the coming 24 hours. Do reach out to us with questions that you have. A couple of questions we may not have had the time to answer. We'll follow up with you by email. And look out for some of the other great webinars that are coming up with Fortuna. But Emma, Caroline, Brendan, thank you very much for all of your advice and encouragement and the idea of enjoying, and always remember, no fluff.
Great advice. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.